Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. This is Adam Huss coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Thank you so much for listening. I'm back from Vitinord, and I just wanted to share some thoughts about that really fun week last week that I had. I don't know if fun is the right word, but super informative. I'm going to be doing a lot of interviews with people I met there. Some fantastic connections were made. I really think that, this is the place where innovation and the cutting edge of wine is happening, because it's where people are experimenting, where people are breeding and thinking about breeding and addressing extremes. And we are increasingly living in a world of extremes, specifically climatically. And that was made very clear by one of the first speakers on the first morning of the first day, who was a wine climatologist. And for those of you who don't work in the space of wine very often in terms of viticulture or anything like that, or if you're just tuning into this podcast and haven't been listening to some of the speakers on here, I see these charts all the time, and I guess it just, is something that I don't even question or, blink at anymore. But when you talk to somebody, any climatologist, anybody who tracks data over the last century, the graphs all look the same. And that's one big impression I have, where it's sort of like, numbers are bumping up and down, bumping around a sort of midline until you hit the 1980s. And then all the graphs just track up. And it's just not a straight line up, but it's a straight angled heading north, heading up the graph to the present day. Every graph is like that. And when you see that from around the world, it's just undeniable, the changes that are coming. And this kind of conference, I think, is really important, where we talk about how to do the things that we're doing in a world where the extremes are getting more extreme. A really cool statistic that I heard right at the beginning of Vitinord was 50% of New World winemaking only uses 7 varieties of grapes currently. And I'll just add, by the way, none of which are native to the New World. So there is room for improvement if we are going to deal with the extremes of climate change. And I think that is a big message that I took away from this, which is, the science points to, if there's a warmer climate, it holds more moisture. More moisture leads to more fungal pressure. And a direct quote from one of the speakers was, if you're in agriculture, you need to experiment, because we need to be breeding for adaptation. We need to be breeding new varieties of grapes that deal with the pressures and the extremes that are already present and only heading up that chart. The chart is just going up. So, one of the other impressions that I had was the crazy extent to which we continue to grow vines that don't belong where they're being grown. So now in northern climates, they're growing grapes under geotextiles, which are it's essentially like every row of the vineyard has its own little mini greenhouse that they go to bed under every winter, rather than just growing a whole vineyard of vines that are adapted to cold climates. We've actually now created this massive input of geotextiles into the vineyard system. That's just one example of that. And then, that's one of those things that made me a little dismayed, but then there's a lot of great examples. And the hopeful thing is, if you haven't been tasting hybrids, Wendy and I just judged a competition a wine competition that was based here in North America. Anybody in the U.S. could submit, or anybody in North America could submit. And I actually got to judge the hybrid panel. And the quality of the wines there were incredible. That was literally just a couple weeks before Vitinord. And then at Vitinord, literally everything I tasted, other than the wines that I brought from California, were made with hybrids, and the quality was phenomenal. It is just absurd that we would even need to think of a separate category for hybrids at this point. There should just be wine competitions. There shouldn't be some separate hybrid versus vinifera category. It's just unnecessary. The quality is ridiculously high and getting better all the time. There are fantastic grapes that will just blow your mind. And please experiment, because there's so much good stuff out there. One other really cool example of something that I found, if you've been listening to this podcast, you've heard me harp on or maybe rant about the need to get away from a wine industry that's based on variety of grape, that we only understand and we only label wine based on varietal characteristics and varietal understandings. And I finally now have a great example of somebody that's doing that, and it's Nova Scotia. And in Nova Scotia, they have an incredible, extreme terroir where they have these crazy tides that literally there's a 50-foot difference between high and low tide. So it creates a bellows effect where as the tides go in and come out, they're creating this literally like a bellows effect for the land where it's sucking in air, pushing in air, sucking out air, pushing in air. And so you have these very distinctive terroir. And they decided, 14 different wineries decided to get together and create a regional identity and a regional brand that they call Tidal Bay. And Tidal Bay does not matter what varieties you grow, but it is a style of wine. It's a white, fresh, aromatic, crisp, and lovely, lively white wine, which of course pairs really well with the seafood that is there in Nova Scotia because you're surrounded by the ocean. And every year the members of this have to submit their wine of this style to a judging panel, and they have to get approved to meet the quality to carry that label, the Tidal Bay label, that year. So it's actually, and you actually have to do this every year, and you could potentially not get approved even if you're one of the members of this conglomeration. So it's this very cool thing where as a consumer, if you get Tidal Bay, you will have a specific style and a quality level that has been judged and been met to get into, to be able to make a Tidal Bay wine that year. So it's a really exciting regional thing that I think everybody should check out, at least as a model to look at what they're doing and how it's working. And one of the cool things that one of the speakers from Tidal Bay said, which again just echoes what I've already mentioned, which is their slogan is, when 80% of the wine in the world is made from the same 20 grapes, do something different. So I think that's what I took away from Vitinord, and I think is a theme for that whole thing as well, and was really valuable stuff that I hope to share more of the speakers coming up soon. My guest for this episode is Max Paschall. Max is a really interesting guy in that he's not specifically a wine guy, although he is growing a experimental vineyard in his yard in Philadelphia, and he owns a small parcel of a few acres in the Poconos where which he has titled Shelterwood Forest Farm. And he has a website for Shelterwood Forest Farm on which he has a blog. And this is how I found Max. Max wrote an article called The Lost Forest Gardens of Europe. And in it, it talks about promiscuous viticulture, promiscuous agriculture, the idea of these ancient traditions of polyculture, perennial polyculture systems that really covered all of Europe at one time for thousands and thousands of years, and to a certain extent still exist in small pockets. Of course, some of that polyculture involved vines and making wine, and so that's where I stumbled upon it and wanted to talk to Max. And as it turned out, he just has a ton of amazing things to say. He's a certified arborist and is just a really smart guy with a science background who is looking at these questions and wants to talk about the stories that sometimes have been marginalized by conventional farming or often have been marginalized by conventional farming and pushed out, and he wants to revive them because the ideas embedded in these systems, embedded in understanding why they were done and how they were done, really reveals an amazing way forward, an amazing amount of solutions to the problems that we're facing. So in this, he talks about the assisted migration of species in reaction to climate change to assist the movement of things that might have grown 500 miles south of where we are currently to here, so that we are helping them prepare for the future, which tends to look like we're going to have the same climate of the things that are 500 miles south of us pretty soon. We talk about the spirit of plants and communication and intent in terms of what they're doing and how we maybe can communicate with them or listen to them better. And we talk about a book called What a Plant Knows and a book called Arboretum America. We talk about his article, Lost Forest Gardens of Europe. And this episode is actually a really fantastic companion episode to the Mark Shepard episode. If you haven't listened to that, I highly recommend. It's just a couple episodes ago. You'll find it. And we also talk about the Temple of Diana. We talk about Provignage and the layering. Provignage is layering. It's a different name for layering. And layering, if you don't know, you'll learn about what that means and how it's used to create a vineyard superorganism. And of course, we talk about growing vines and trees. This is really a philosophical, information-rich, deeply researched thing, much like Max's article, where we cover so many ideas I don't even know how to begin. It's just a fun, great conversation with a smart guy, and I'm really grateful for Max for doing it, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. If you enjoy this podcast, please support by subscribing to our Patreon channel, which I'll link to in the show notes, and also giving a great review and subscribing on whatever podcast app you're on. Thank you so much, and enjoy. Max, welcome. Thanks for doing this. Appreciate you coming on and being willing to talk about some of this research that you've done. But before we get into that, I would love to just hear, where are you in the world and what do you do generally?
Yeah. So thanks for having me on. My name is Max Paschall. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm a professional gardener and arborist. And in my free time, I have a blog at shelterwoodforestfarm.com. Where I just like to write about weird historical agroforestry topics, ecological restoration, and sometimes things about assisted migration of native species in anticipation of climate change.
Oh, I really like that. I mean, I would imagine you must think that there's a good case for a lot of assisted migration of species happening right now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think, I think, you have to be really careful about it, obviously. But in the past few years, there's been a really growing scientific consensus around the necessity for it. Essentially, obviously, we don't want to be rearranging species wholesale, across the planet. Like we've seen what happens when you do that. But if you do it responsibly, there's a lot to be said for moving a native species that's maybe 500 miles to the south of here, and moving up here just to see, not to see, but to essentially prepare the environment here for what things are projected to be like in the next 100 years.
Right. So maybe, and you have a little piece of land outside of Philly, if that's right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, are you growing coffee and cacao then there?
No,
in preparation.
No, but I actually did plant like a pomegranate, and that's surviving pretty well, and lots of bald cypress and
oh
black
my God, really?
pawpaws, persimmons, like things that haven't historically grown in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, at least in the past 40,000 years. But they actually thrived in that area. 40,000 years ago when the temperature here was just 1 degree higher than today.
Wow.
So in a sense, they were native here at a point when
right.
the climate was a little bit more what it's going to be like in the future.
They just headed south. They just took a trip with the temperature down toward the equator.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you see? I'm guessing you've read the book The Overstory.
I haven't actually. I've been meaning to.
Oh, I really hope you do.
I'm so sorry.
Dang it. Well,
I'm a fraud.
I mean, all right, this is the end. I'm going to hit stop. No, I mean, it does. It's kind of irrelevant because I'm just curious do you have a sense? Okay, the reason I brought it up is because the author anthropomorphizes trees. I mean, to the extent that they're a character. The trees are these multiple characters, and then they're sort of bigger characters. And the Overstory takes on this very cool meaning, of course, because of that. about this story that transcends the human drama, a story that is much bigger in scale of time and in scope of, whatever, just like, these in scope of size as well, because it's a story that spans ecosystems and regions and continents. And I'm wondering if not having read that, if you have thought about these ideas of this, when I say that these pawpaws and things that once were there 40,000 years ago, and I know pawpaws are still there. I mean, I know they're growing up in the Finger Lakes region too, but these other species that have not been there for a long time and moved south, do you see them having that kind of actual, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of, what is the word I'm looking for? Intent and awareness and, I don't know, spirit life, to be acting with purpose in what they're doing? Or how do you see plants? I mean, you clearly are, somebody who works with them professionally, and I'm just curious, does it transcend that? Are you a hardcore, sort of deductive scientist, or what? I don't know. That's a pretty broad question, but feel free to approach that any way you want.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I, I don't know, I've worked for a very long time with trees, just pruning them, growing them, climbing in them, and lots of plants too. And I I think there's the my personal spiritual belief side, and then there's the side that I bring to work every day. So I'm not going into work and talking to like the trees necessarily, but in my backyard, I do sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I think just in what I've seen and experienced, I think there's a lot more just going on with plants than we can really perceive. And there's been a lot of science recently coming out about that, particularly around like the root systems, the mycorrhizae, and the
Yeah.
connections, and the way that trees can communicate with each other. I
Yeah.
I think for things like this, I tend to um, try not to. I personally, I don't have like a very strong conviction one way or the other, but I just usually tend to defer to people into communities that have a much broader experience with this than I do. Um, so in here in North America, if Native people and Indigenous people, when they talk about and not just here, but all over the world, all kinds of Indigenous folks have these cosmologies where they talk about the spirits that exist in trees and rocks and rivers and things like that. I'm not here to discount any of that. So I think, and I personally have gotten a lot of value out of. I think just seeing the trees in my garden or the plants in my garden with that kind of lens,
Yeah.
whether or not it's real, I think it's for me like the effect that it has on me as someone who tends that garden is really positive.
Yeah. Have you read any Stephen Buhner?
A
You know,
little bit, yeah.
okay. I'm nearing the end of his book, The Secret Teachings of Plants.
Mm,
I really am enjoying it, and
mm,
of course, I'm not coming from a science based, although I'm coming from a sort of, I mean, personally, I'm not like that's not what I went to school for or anything. It was a hard science thing. Actually, my degree is in religion, so that'll tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. This storytelling and myth, and definitely connection to spirit and things like that. Although I, lost my own religion while studying religion, if that tells you anything else. But it's the Stephen this book particularly really starts with what I would say is a way of leading the scientific mind into, I guess, understanding the edges of and limits of scientific understanding,
mm,
by talking about, like electromagnetism in plants and bioelectricity in all creatures, and that there are, these fields that are actually measurable, and and then it, essentially breaks down, or I would say builds up this understanding of all of these things that are super complex, that are measurable, but that are usually ignored when talking about these things. And we usually just reduce, discussions of plants and things like that to the biology, to the hard biology and chemistry that's happening. And he's trying to show that there's these sort of, even within the science, there are these other things that have been largely unexplored relating to, their similarity to us as creatures and just to beings of energy beyond just beings of biology. And I mean, the argument ultimately is that there is a way to communicate with plants. That plants may be talking to us, and not in the way that we think of in words and things like that, but that there is like a communication aspect to that. And obviously, you haven't read it, so I can't ask you to comment on any of that. But have you? You've already answered the question, but I'm just curious if you had anything else to say in terms of talking to plants,
Yeah, yeah,
or if any of that, sort of the stuff that is beyond what we think we know, and then there's a lot more to know kind of idea. Have you encountered that, or
yeah. I think
I mean,
there's
I'm
three other
happy
books.
for pushback, please. If
Oh,
you
no, no, no. There's actually three books that I've read that have really influenced, I guess, my understanding or my views on this. One is What a Plant Knows by Daniel Chamovitz. It's kind of like, it sounds a little bit like what you're describing, but it's going at it from from a scientific perspective. Um, so the book goes into
Hmm,
like some of those areas that that we mentioned earlier about how science is starting to catch up with this and see all the different ways that plants kind of perceive the world around them, even without having necessarily like a central nervous system or a brain.
right,
And
right,
how even like things like color can be perceived through their leaves, and that they
right.
react in accordance with that. Um, so from like a purely scientific perspective, I think that's an excellent book that kind of opens up, or for me, it opened up my understanding of the complexity of lives, like the complexity that plants have in their day to day life. Um, Another book was Arboretum America, um, and I don't know if you've read that one, but it's
No,
one of those books that really that I found people who know nothing about trees and people who have worked with trees for 40 years, they both love it as much. Like it is one of those books that is
oh
really
wow,
really wonderful.
okay,
It's by this Irish Canadian writer, Diana Beresford Kroger, and that goes through a lot of trees that are native to the Northeast here, and looking at not just like their biology and their relation to their environment, but also their cultural significance and their historical place within the lives and cosmologies of different native groups here, um, and medicinal uh, aspects to them as well. So that's a really great one. Um,
hmm.
and then, of course, like the third book is Braiding Sweetgrass,
Oh yeah,
which
of course, yeah.
is a huge favorite for a lot of people for very good reason. And so that's helped me really, I think, just see a more mature perspective on this kind of question. So
Yeah.
I've really appreciated uh, those books and influences because I'm not somebody who um, has like a deep spiritual perceptions of anything. I was I was raised in a fairly atheist household, and so when I talk to trees, when I leave them offerings, I don't necessarily hear anything back, but it's a practice that I keep up and that I enjoy, and yeah,
Yeah.
and like I said, I think if nothing else, it helps me change or rewire the way that I perceive them, because it's very easy just to lose sight of plants and just to see them as furniture in the background. But once you see them, and once you keep up the practice of seeing them as these vibrant, complex beings, I think that really starts to open up different ways of approaching them.
That's a really, yeah, you brought up some really beautiful things. I mean for me, I was raised in the opposite of an atheist household, but I think, and then having become an atheist at some, and then I don't even like the term atheist because it's like a reaction against something that you know what I mean, like it's like
Hmm.
you're defining yourself as a not something as opposed to just being yourself, you know what I mean, as opposed to just being a human, not defined in relation to this one specific idea, but I love the idea that what I learned from that, and is that this language that we use, and even our ability to understand language. I was just listening to this, is I think this was actually in Stephen Buhner's book, the the secret. the secret teachings of plants, is just, our ability to understand language is because, or our ability to use language is because of our ability to understand that there is meaning. Like, the words are this surface thing floating on this ocean of meaning, and they all become, language is just metaphor essentially, and very, obviously very surface metaphor, because the meanings go much deeper. And so things like, where in biodynamics, I'm trying to tie this into what we're talking about a little bit, is like, you're supposed to leave 10% of the farm wild, because that's where, generation happens. That's where creativity happens, and wild in quotes, whatever that means. I know it's a word that's fraught with a lot of colonial ideas and things like that, but 10% is this part of your farm that you just don't touch, and you let it be without your intent, and and then you see what happens. And sometimes the most exciting part of your farm becomes that part, and it's where new things happen. It's where where you learn. It's where it's the most teaching part. It's where, generation comes from, of new ideas and new plants, and new varieties of the plants that you're trying to grow in the other 90%, where they get planted by seed, by birds, or by animals pooping them out or whatever, and all of a sudden you have this new thing that you didn't intend, and it's doing better than everything else that you did intend. And then I tie that into that 10% that is supposed to be given to God in a religious tradition as a tithe or whatever. And it's like, you could see it the same way. I mean, you could look at it in either thing, that you could call that wild, you could call that nature, you could call that the 10% that you're giving to God. But that's where this unintended thing happens, depending on what the metaphor is that you're using for it. Anyway, all that is to say, this idea of meaning beneath that, obviously this is one of those samples where you see the meaning beneath the words, and perhaps there is meaning. Obviously, everything becomes a metaphor at a certain point, if we're all a form of energy, and these plants are a form of energy. And why wouldn't we be able to understand and sort of communicate with that meaning in some way, like the meaning that is beneath our thought word ideas, and the meaning that is within the plants, and their whatever it is that their form of communication really just overlays a deeper connection in this ocean of meaning beneath the surface. I don't know. So you brought that up. It was just a thought I had, and feel free to react to that or not. I love the books that you recommended, and I think Robin Wall Kimmerer's book specifically, I mean, just the title is about that connection and crossover of how to marry those two ways of seeing the world, right? I mean, that's the image of braiding sweetgrass, is this weaving of multiple ways of seeing the world, and that they're not necessarily polarities, but that they can actually be intertwined. And you when you do that, when you don't just exclude one or the other, that you find the common meaning beneath the two, how they, once they're woven together. I'm just rambling at this point.
No, it's great. Yeah.
Stop me anyway, if you have anything to say.
Yeah, no, I think, and I see this a lot too. I feel like those of us, whether, raised in this like very Christian or, very religious context, or not, but those of us in the West who essentially just grew up in this civilization in this point in time, I think a lot of us, on different levels, just really miss having some kind of like real, tangible connection with the land, and with the kind of spiritual life that comes from that connection.
Yeah.
A lot of our ancestors, like for someone like me, my ancestors mostly come from Europe. And before they came here, a few thousand years ago, they just lived in small villages, like farming their crops in a fairly sustainable way most of the time, and had these like very rich lives that were connected with the seasons and connected with the spirits of the land. They would pray to trees, they would do all these different things. And I think a lot of parts of our society have, kind of conspired to get rid of those things, and to, in the past, demonize them, or even just to push them out in the marketplace of ideas. And in doing so, I think when I see things like biodynamics, or many of the other ways that people try to rekindle that spiritual connection with the land and with farming, with their work. I see what I see is exactly that, just missing that rich spiritual life that no matter where you come from in the world, your ancestors used to have. And that might have been one generation ago, it might have been 100 generations ago, but all of us have that history.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, when we're thinking about how to approach land respectfully with all the complexities of, for someone like me living as a settler in, like on a colonized continent, it can be difficult to kind of find how to get back to, how to find a way to reintegrate some of those things into your life, without it being appropriative or misguided. So yeah, I see a lot of people kind of grappling with those questions and doing really interesting things with it too. So I've really enjoyed kind of seeing, what people kind of come up with.
Yeah. And I know we just dove right into the deep end, which I love. I want to pull back, and I hope it's obvious when talking about wine that plants and trees are where wine comes from, and that's why this is an important discussion to have for me on this podcast. But you are. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the things that you are doing personally, not with not for your day job or whatever, but that you are playing around with Shelterwood Forest and why it's named that, and what you're doing there in Philly in your front yard and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit earlier about some of the more southern native species that I've been bringing up to Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
and just being careful that none of them have invasive qualities, but just thinking about what might do well here, given a different climate in 50 or 100 years. But yeah, besides that, so in my yard in Philly, I just planted out a bunch of winter rye, winter barley, winter wheat. I gathered a lot of different old heirlooms and land races, and have just kind of mixed them together to try to breed something like a more diverse population that more closely replicates the kind of really resilient crop populations that have traditionally been used around the world, and instead
Yeah.
of just like a single just monoculture of like one hybrid wheat, which usually is what farmers grow.
Right.
Yeah, and besides that, I planted a very small vineyard of about 20 vines in my front yard, with the goal to kind of find like what what can I actually grow here without spraying. Um, and so it's all hybrids and just straight native species. And yeah, here in the Mid Atlantic, I don't know if I've ever seen more than a handful of grapes that weren't just riddled with disease.
Yeah.
It's only like the really wild ones, things like yeah. I brought up a muscadine here, which isn't native here. It's more native to the southeast, but it's
Right.
doing great here, and it's the most disease-free thing I grow. Um,
There
but
you go. Yeah.
yeah, I'd love to just kind of
Is it
grow them out.
stanky?
It it is a little stanky. I'm not gonna lie, but every time I bite into one, I just try to remember how healthy it is for me, and and I know there are people down south who know how to actually work with the stank, but I'm not there yet.
No, I just recently heard about that. Yeah, where it's like you haven't, if you think Foxy is that sort of grape soda flavor, then you haven't really smelled Foxy. You haven't smelled a Foxy muscadine. But yeah, it's funny. I wondered about that. But clearly it's a great place to start if you're breeding grapes, right? Like it shows its total resilience to all these things. If you keep that and breed out the stank and breed in some, delicious aromas and flavors perhaps, and then you might have gold right there, it's a great starting place for a breeding program, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, and there's I've been really lucky to be part of this Google listserv called Grape Breeders. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
Well,
it's
now I want to become.
it is phenomenal. It is all these professional and hobbyist grape breeders from around the country, who just kind of compare notes, and it's is absolutely like amazing what they talk about. And I've learned more just in a few months of reading through those conversations there than I have anywhere else. So one of the
Oh,
people I learned about there is this gentleman who unfortunately passed away recently, Bob Zender down in Florida,
mm,
who also was, he spent decades creating this no spray vineyard in, again, one of the worst places to grow grapes.
right,
But
right.
he created these hybrids that produce like incredible quality, and without the need for sprays, which is something that is almost unheard of. I know there's Kesselring vineyards out in the Midwest, and maybe one or two other people, but I think that to me is the most exciting work that's happening with grape breeding.
Yeah, I mean, so it's unfortunate that it's rare that people are using sprays because I think it's only rare in the last 100 years. You know what I mean? Like it was never like that was agriculture. And I want to get into that. I mean, I'm sure that maybe sulfur is a little older than that, but in terms of like fungicides and all these things that are now available on the market, pesticides of massive kinds and herbicides, like that's less than 100 years. This is like post World War II stuff, and it's like, so there is a way to do this, right? And there's a way to do it without sprays, and I just feel like we've reached that point where this experiment with chemistry has proven to be a massive failure in terms of human health and environmental health, and I think the only objective that everybody in agriculture should have is a no spray whatever it is that they're doing. Like wherever you are, if it has to be sprayed, don't grow it. Grow the next thing. I mean, spray it until you've bred it, used it as a breeding tool to breed with something that doesn't need to be sprayed, and then stop. The goal should be to get off sprays. This is at least my very hardcore, like but this is my message for everybody in wine specifically. Like, just don't plant it if it needs to be sprayed there, and if it does need to be sprayed, then don't plant it. I'm just repeating that. And I know that's like a hard line because even people who are growing organically are spraying tons of stuff, and that's I think that would be a step in the right direction for the most part, but I don't think that copper is any better for the environment than some of the fungicides that are chemical and synthetic, and could be worse potentially depending on how often you have to use it, since it isn't systemic, and some of those fungicides are and only need to be sprayed once or twice or three times a year, whereas copper needs to be reapplied and reapplied and reapplied, and it's horrible for aquatic life and builds up in the soil and is toxic to lots of different life, soil life, and every human life and aquatic life. So yeah, no spray I think is the way to go, and the fact that he's doing it in Florida shows that it's possible, anywhere in the U.S., frankly, and it just takes the time and care to breed grapes that are hardy in those climates and are resistant naturally. And I know there's that is a big objective in breeding, and I really appreciate you sharing that resource of this and getting into grape breeding, and this idea that we didn't used to need the I mean, everything was no spray at one point in history, and for all history was no spray up until just recently. Brings me to why you're on this podcast in the first place. Why we're having this conversation is I am doing research about vines and trees and vitiforestry and these polycultures that include vines, and I stumbled upon this article called "The Lost Forest Gardens of Europe," and this article is one of the most deeply researched things I've found online, with multiple sources from multiple languages and time periods. And you are its author, and it's on the Shelterwood Forest Farm blog. And can you talk about that article and what went into writing that? Why you wrote that? What led you to that?
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of in line with what we were talking about earlier, for years, I've just been really curious about what was going on in Europe for all these huge expanses of time. Every time, I would learn about a different continent, whether it's North America or Australia or different parts of Asia or Africa. There are always these rich histories of indigenous cultures, with these complex relationships with the land and these really innovative methods of farming. And with Europe, I think the kind of story that we all grow up with is that, oh, it's just a lot of monocultures, just a lot of wheat fields and maybe some orchards and some cattle, and vineyards. But the fact that, I guess what I started to see in researching this is that that's actually the opposite of what most of Europe's history was like. Even up until the 1950s, something like 97 to 98% of all the farms in Italy were these incredibly diverse, um, perennial polycultures where you have wine grapes growing up trees that are whose branches are cut for fodder for the livestock, and in between these rows of trees and grapes, there's all these fields of wheat, corn, beans, pasture, and so on a single farm you have a harvest of staple crops, specialty items like wine, meat, milk, livestock, and even in the first half of the 20th century, over half of the domestic wood production, the timber production in all of Italy was coming from these farms. So not only were these farms producing ostensibly just food, but as a byproduct, they're supplying over half of the country's timber, which is absolutely incredible. And so, yeah, for most of Europe's history, there have been these like very complex and diverse agricultural systems that have been predominantly done by uh, peasants and indigenous people and folks who frequently get either removed or left out of history. And
Mm.
it's only in the past century or two, and particularly the last 70 years, that you start to see the disappearance of those systems really accelerate. And there's still some examples of them left, which is even more incredible when you think about it.
Yeah.
There's places where they have the same kind of system that has been grown in that region for 8,000 years.
Wow.
So yeah, there's these really long traditions that I think we we have a lot to learn from, and especially when thinking about sustainability, climate change, or any of these like big buzzwords or really, frankly, important things. Um, they were dealing with all the same things, right? The climate has changed dramatically in the last 8,000 years,
Yeah.
in a variety of directions. There's people have been coping with a lot of the same things that we cope with today, and these really diverse farming systems have kind of stood the test through time through all of it. And so there's definitely something to learn from there, I think.
And do we know why they've stood the test of time? Like, why have they been successful?
Yeah, so in your episode with Mark Shepard, he talked about how his farm is essentially just looking at what the local ecosystem for him looks like, and then kind of rearranging it into something a little bit more ordered and semi-domesticated. And that's essentially like what makes this work. Um, if you have,
It's already happening there naturally. Like it's already successful, and you're just adding or increasing its success or increasing its whatever it's doing. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. You have, instead of deer and bison and wolves, you have your farm dog, you've got cattle, you've got sheep. Instead of wild trees with grapes growing up in them, and meadows and fields, you have those same native trees just brought out individually into a wheat field and planted in rows, and with a domesticated grape growing up them and being trellised between the trees. And so you have this. Every level of the forest or of the local ecosystem, you have all the components of it, but it's in a way that works better for you and makes your life easier. And it's only when those things got separated and that we started to get to the kinds of systems that we see today, where you have 1,000 acres of wheat and you have a large orchard and you have a large vineyard, and it's all these monocultures. What
yeah,
happens when you disaggregate these things is you no longer have the wheat growing underneath it, so all of a sudden you have weeds. You no longer have all the like the honeybees and the silkworms in the mulberry trees, so you have different kinds of insect pests coming in. You don't have all these mitigating factors that ecosystems allow for, that where they have all these checks and balances that really prevent a lot of the worst kind of predations that happen, all that's gone. So this monoculture is basically just naked in the wind. Um, and so these, like for instance, in Italy, like these systems, uh, they they resisted phylloxera up until the 20th century. Even when they're pulling out, some of the last vines from these diverse systems in Umbria in the later half of the 20th century, they still hadn't been infected yet. So there's a lot about not just like the biology, but even just the architecture of these systems that really buffers each of the crops against a lot of the worst things out there. And it also means that if you have a bad year, you know, let's say you have just one vineyard of Syrah, if you have a bad year for that, then your whole crop is done. But if you have all these different kinds of trees, all these other crops on the ground, all this livestock, then you've got an insurance policy that essentially means that you're not going to go broke in a year.
Yeah.
And so something that does well one year might not do well the next, but that's okay because you have five other things that can kind of make up for it.
Yeah. There's some great photos on your article that I think more than almost anything I've seen, it's sort of that, yeah, you can actually see what we're talking about. Like I just think that there are no examples of it currently in the US. So anybody thinking about this is like, who knows what they're thinking, what their mind's picture is. And so just one of these photos where, you have these coppiced, what I meant to say here was pollarded. Pollarded means cut at about head height, like you sort of top a tree, just chop it right around head height, and then little branches grow out around that head height area. Coppiced means cutting almost all the way down to the ground. Is very different. Is not what I meant. I say it here twice. I apologize. I was thinking pollarded and saying coppiced, and luckily Max does correct me very nicely in a little bit, but I wanted to add in here as you're thinking about this, as I'm trying to describe and create a picture for you, don't imagine coppicing, imagine pollarding. All right. Maple trees probably with, the vine sort of trellised at about head height between them, draped between these, spaced evenly at about, I don't know, maybe 10 feet, maybe who knows what, just making stuff up. But it's, this one image, you get this idea and you see it, and you see like an alley cropping system with trees that, separated by rows of trees with vine that are acting as vine trellises, as well as, like you said, coppicing them and using as fodder or whatever else, and basket supplies, weaving supplies, and then that alley is being farmed in multiple ways, whether it's hay, whether it's corn, whether it's wheat, annual crops, or maybe it's just grazing for animals that are in that system. It's just, I guess I'm just recommending to look at the website because the images convey so much more than just trying to understand this, because I think people get a sense of, I don't know, when I first heard about it, I started discounting it. And then when you see it and you're like, oh, no, that makes total sense. I can see how that would work and is working and has worked, and maybe slightly smarter than, because it's a living trellis that will continually improve with age versus a dead trellis, which will continually need maintenance and repair as it ages. It's just constantly degrading with age. So there's that that aspect of it as well. What led you to? I mean, this is deeply researched. I mean, I couldn't believe, like, when I started clicking out, because some of these the sources that you cite, I was just like really fascinated to check those out, and it's like you're finding old Italian texts and all kinds of stuff from deep online that I'm just wondering what took you to do. Like, I don't, I imagine you didn't get paid to do this. Like, why did you do this? Like, what is it about you that made you want to do this deeply researched? And you even told me that, to the extent that your Italian fell short of these texts, you just were pasting entire pages into Google Translate. So this is how you were reading some of these texts, because
Yeah.
there weren't English versions of them. So what went into all that work?
Well, essentially, I'm just really good at Googling. And yeah, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about living in this day and age, that you can find all this kind of information online pretty easily. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think for me it was an attempt to just learn about things that I could connect with on a personal level, and to see um, you know when um, when did people get it right? like when, like how did people get it right? There's so much wrong in the world right now. It's so easy to get down on things, and so
Mm.
easy to forget just how close we are in many cases to the solutions, and to ways
Yeah.
that are much better. And where some of these places still exist, in Italy or in Portugal. It's incredible, like, that they're not, on the cover of every, newspaper, when you think about, like, how vitally important some of these places are. um, and so for me, in
Where?
writing this, it was just, like, I think, an attempt to, like, once I found just how rich this story was, it was just an attempt to, put it out there as comprehensively as possible.
Yeah, it is, and it is that, and I mean, because of that, I think it's this amazing online resource. I don't know if you track analytics on it, but how's it do? Do you know? Is it just weird people like me that click and get obsessed with it?
Yeah, but the good thing is there's a lot of weird people like us. There's it's done well, and I don't make any money off this. This is not, I'm not promoting
Right,
anything. This is,
right.
I just, I think there's some really valuable things that have been done, and are still done, and I would really love to see them be done by more farmers. And that
Yeah,
that is my overriding goal in all of this, is just to see if, the conversations we have about sustainability and about agriculture can be a little bit more informed by, yeah, by some of these practices that have truly stood the test of time.
yeah. I'd like to see these ideas spread as well, which is why I do this as well. Um, this is yeah. No, it's really it's just. I mean, I could say so much good about it, but people should just read it. It's the Lost Forest Gardens of Europe, and if you just Google that, you should find it. It's pretty much. I don't know. I think that should do it, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think, um, yeah, and going back to what we are talking about a little bit earlier, with no spray. I'm also somebody who very, strongly believes in a future without any kinds of sprays. And,
Yeah,
as somebody who doesn't have, like, a stake in the game, it's very easy, I think, for me to have that
yeah, yeah,
opinion. But
yeah.
but I think one of
Me
the
too.
really wonderful things about, um, learning about these systems is seeing that, once you give up sprays, you can gain so much more, right? Because
Yeah,
if you're spraying stuff all the time, then you can't harvest necessarily, like, the fruit that's growing on the tree that the grape is trellised on. You can't, plant all these other crops and have animals go through there. You can't harvest mushrooms. You can't, you lose so many different kinds of yields that you can get out of a grape vineyard or a grape agricultural system, when you're spraying. And once that leaves, then it opens up all these possibilities.
yeah. Not
And I think
not to
that's.
mention you.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, not to mention you lose the costs of all those inputs as well,
Yeah.
like where you, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, no. That was it. But yeah, that's exactly it. So I think there's a lot to look forward to in giving up these things as well.
Yeah, and yeah. Well, I mean, we could go on. It seems like yeah, like you, and just with the two of us talking about it, I guess we have to be careful that we're not two farmers with 100 acres at stake advising people to go for it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that is there is a little bit of that in me too, where it's like I intend to do that and I plan to do that, and I think I see the principles and I want to spread the principles from other people that know better than I do. And it seems like, like that was the objective of that Mark Shepard thing was, I knew that this was somebody who was doing it over 100 acres and can talk about it from that perspective of like, he's whatever 30 years into it and it's successful, it's happening.
Hmm.
And he hasn't sprayed in that entire time as well. And, can make a living and do everything else from that land and has abundance and has now I mean I just it was like when I interviewed Tom Plocker as well. It was like just this light bulb went off for me. I was just like I just could not believe like that this process, and yes, it is a risky process in terms of the success rate of finding that new variety that ticks all the boxes, that is delicious, that is cold climate, cold resistant in the winter, that is resists all the pest pressures in terms of the mildews, all the fungal pressures and things that are endemic in your area, and also makes great wine. I mean, that's it. I think I'm talking to another grape breeder soon, and he's like, the numbers that people say are something like 1 in 10,000. He's like, I think it's actually more than that. So this can be, this is a 10 to 20 year period to get a few varieties of grapes, 2 or 3 maybe varieties of grapes that are new, that tick all those boxes or most of those boxes. But in the same amount of time, if many people had done that, or if regionally there were breeders that we were all supporting to do that for us, and it was more of this thing. And I know obviously there is this online forum now, the Grape Breeder Forum, that I now have to check out. Do you have a sense of how many people are part of that?
I don't. I think
Okay.
maybe dozens, maybe a few hundred. Um,
Yeah.
but it's one of the really great things that I've learned from just being in that group is just how easy it can be, right? If so, like if
Right.
you're somebody who has aspirations of breeding your own grape variety, but you think, oh, it's going to be too difficult. Oh, I don't have the space, or whatever. People have some really creative solutions to this. So there was this one gentleman,
Wow.
I can't remember his name, but he would breed like thousands of grapes. He would just do all these crosses, and then he'd plant out the seeds into like the fence line along the highways around him, where he saw that vines were growing naturally and they weren't getting
Right.
cut down. So he would just plant out all these like excellent vines with really great genetics, then come back 5 years later and see what was doing really well and make selections from that. And there's ways to do it, right? And
Yeah.
even in other areas like the like knockout roses, right? Like the rose you can get at every Lowe's or Home Depot. Um, the person who bred those, he did it in his basement here in Pennsylvania, and now he's a multimillionaire. So
Yeah.
there's a lot to be said for just creative solutions to breeding, and also just how much fun it can be too.
Yeah, yeah, especially if you have the right temperament for it, and everything too. And it's, I think going back to like how did people do no spray for millennia? Well, that's how. They knew, they've been breeding and selecting, like this is what humans have been doing, and it's only in this century that instead of breeding and selecting, we funneled all those resources into R&D for chemicals, for chemical sprays and things like that. I think that was the sort of light bulb that went off for me, that was just like, man, we just basically hit the pause button on millennia of this process of thinking of agriculture as a process, and decided that it would now become, a way to just protect these precious things that we all obsess over, that we think we must have, even though they don't do well anymore. We can't change the fact that we want this kind of tomato or that kind of corn or that kind of wheat, or it has to be the thing that we've always had that makes us comfortable.
Hmm.
And so we've now had to create an industry to make that possible, so that we don't have to change. And it's like, no, let's embrace the change. Let's remember that change is part of the process of agriculture, and it has to be embedded in that process. It has to, like, agriculture has to be change, and has to be a process of change and adaptation. It can't be this thing of keeping it the way it is, keeping the same grape varieties for 200 years, and just only thinking that those are the ones that are worth drinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think that's what's really interesting about it. Shelterwood Forest Farm, what are your values behind that, and what is it now currently for you? Is it and
Yeah. So it started out as at first I had the goal of starting, a commercial farm. But then in 2020 with the pandemic, and I think like a lot of people, a lot of things in my life got shifted around. A lot of other priorities kind of came into focus, and so I think the Shelterwood Forest Farm project for me has taken a backseat for the time being. But it's always been an outlet for me to kind of explore what just more about like what interesting folks are doing in the world of ecological restoration and farming. Um, and the name comes from this forestry practice where you leave the largest trees in the forest when you're going in to clear out timber, because those are the
Mm.
strongest ones that can help preserve the good genetic makeup of the forest and repopulate it. Around here in Philadelphia, there's a lot of heritage trees, so trees that are we call them pen trees here, and that are older than
Mm.
400 years. So there's trees like there's a tree in my neighborhood that was here before any Europeans were. Right, there's trees that have existed here for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years that are just kind of hanging out in a park or like on the edge of a trail or in someone's backyard, and it's easy to kind of overlook those and to forget about them. But these trees have, much like these farming systems that we've been talking about, these trees have weathered a significant amount of change in climate and landscape, and are worth
Yeah.
preserving and propagating from. And so I think that same ethic kind of goes through as a story or a line throughout all of the different areas of research that I've done and different projects that I'm trying out. Um, and so I think that just trying to honor what's been here for a very long time and learn from it is the goal as it stands.
Yeah, I don't know if I mentioned I'm from Pennsylvania as well, and I always love that it's the one state whose name is about the woods,
Yeah.
Uh, it's about the forest. Um, I think that's great. It's nice that it seems to breed foresters as well. People who love trees. Strangely, I found a lot of them coming from Pennsylvania. I don't know what that's all about. um, I don't know if you have ever been. Have you ever been to Rome?
Yeah, a few times when I was a little bit younger.
Okay, I discovered at the Temple of Diana, which is like a in the middle of the Borghese Park. I can't even remember what it's one of the central parks of Rome. But does that ring a bell at all?
I don't recall.
It's there's an inscription on it in Latin that's what is it? It's Silvarum potent. Wait, Nocta luce Silvarum potenti, which I believe the best translation I found for it means to the mighty night shine of the forest.
Mm,
And I
that's
love that.
great.
I don't even know what it means. I just love it. But yeah, I was I named one of our wines Noctilucens because that's the English version
Mm,
of Noctiluce. But it yeah, it ties to that, and I don't know. I just love what that evokes, and I guess if anybody has spent time in the woods at night without a flashlight or campfire, maybe would know what that means. Would maybe begin to get a sense of that. But it's something that forces you outside your comfort zone to be able to experience this magical thing that is being evoked by this ancient inscription on the Temple of Diana in Rome, because you have to go into the woods first of all, which are forbidden, and you have to be out there at night when humans are supposed to be safe in our warm little huts and caves, and you have to be without light, so that you can see the light that's out there. And there's something that the understanding of that phrase, I think, requires this sense of courage and going transgressing human borders and warnings and things like that. So I think there's something really cool about that.
yeah, to your point of that courage, I think that's exactly in line with what we've been talking about. Where people who are growing grapes now, I think, or even just working in the industry, like that kind of courage is needed to do what we need to do to make sure that wine persists, right, and that it does so in a sustainable way. That I think that's a really great idea to keep in mind for it.
Yeah. Is there any way that you want people who are listening to who want to reach out and ask you questions or get in contact for any reason? Do you want any kind of contact information to be mentioned, or do you want to send anybody to your website or
Oh
anything like
yeah,
that?
yeah. There's a contact page on my website, and that goes right to my personal email. So that's way easier than spelling my last name.
So just shelterwoodforestfarm.com.
That's right.
And And the most recent blog post is that Lost Forest Gardens of Europe post, right? If
Yeah.
I'm not mistaken. And then there's some other good stuff on there too. Anything else you'd recommend? It's a nice redwood post there in the Forest of Living Gods.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun. There's a lot of fun stuff. I wrote one a couple years ago about actually about hybrid and native grapes, and it's uh, is when I first started getting into grapes. So it might be kind of old hat for people who know a lot more about wine than I do. But it has some good info in it too.
Is that the one called The Future of American Wine is Native?
Yep, that's it.
I 100% agree. That's awesome. I also love Could Ants Revolutionize Organic Pest Management? I don't know.
Oh yeah,
There's a lot of great stuff
some
on
good
here.
sleepers in there. Yeah. Oh man.
um, well, thank you for doing the work that goes into writing these things and spreading these ideas, because I know, I mean, anybody when they read your Lost Forest Gardens of Europe will see what I'm talking about. There's a ton of research. I mean, hours and hours and days of research that I'm sure went into just doing something because you really are uh, excited by these ideas and want to share them. So I thank you for that.
Oh yeah, and I can't take all the credit. Quarantine definitely helped with
Hey, there
giving
you
me
go.
giving me the time for that.
Boredom is our friend.
Yes.
Uh, being trapped inside. Is there do you have any closing thoughts or ideas or just comments?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think so. This doesn't even need to go. If you do record this, yeah, this doesn't even need to go in the final thing. But I think something. Have you ever heard of Provignage?
Yeah. Why have I heard of that? It's I mean, this sounds like a winemaking technique. Oh no,
Yeah,
it's layering. It's layering. Yeah, it's
yeah.
viticulture. It's when we call it layering here. I've heard it called Provignage or what I forget. There's another one. There's a couple of different things for it, but essentially you can create like this um what's the word I'm looking for? Like a super organism out of a vineyard where
Hmm.
there's a mother plant, a mother vine, and then the entire vineyard is just an extension of that one vine through the soil, like by letting it grow up and then back down through the soil and rerooting and up again and back down, and you keep branching those out through an entire vineyard system, and it's literally connected, and then in every way, in that whole system is a single vine, essentially a single superorganism.
Yeah, that was when I started looking into how people trellised grapes in the past. I
Uh-huh.
was just kind of curious. Okay, if they weren't putting them in trees and they weren't putting them obviously on wire, which is pretty recent, then what were they doing? And that's when I first heard about layering and Provignage, especially in different parts of France. I think in Champagne it was what they did almost entirely until
Right.
phylloxera.
Right.
Um, but one of the really interesting things I read about when researching it, um, someone gave the example in this old book from the 19th century about how this German wine grower had moved to Ohio and bought this hillside and then planted Catawba grapes. I think a native grape or a native hybrid, and
Yeah.
then did Provignage with it. Um, and I think that's kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier with grape breeding. That's another area that where no one's really like done that to my knowledge, since phylloxera. Like this is one of the most long lasting ways of growing grapes was just layering them into a superorganism. Um,
Yeah.
and no, everybody's just kind of like left it because you can't do that with wine grapes. But if you have a hybrid that is phylloxera resistant, I'd be really curious to see what happens. Um,
That would be really fun. Now, I will say I do believe, and I'd have to confirm this, but last I heard, it was happening out here in California in Santa Barbara. If you have sandy enough soil in a dry enough climate, you can get away with not worrying about phylloxera. Essentially, like it's going to be kept at bay, and it is a long process. Is the one thing, because it's sort of like it grows exponentially, but you have to start with a couple vines and then layer them, but each year that you layer them you're increasing the amount of layering that you can do, so it can sort of spread exponentially over the years, but it does take years to do this, to fill a vineyard essentially. And I love that idea of the I mean, I don't know, it just the idea of a fully connected superorganism vineyard, um not that there aren't connections already happening in vineyards, but that idea is really intriguing and exciting for some reason. There's
Yeah,
something really like,
absolutely.
yeah, like that massive vine covering an entire hillside,
Yeah.
and,
And who
and
knows, like
brooding.
maybe it sucks, right? Like maybe it doesn't work that well, but like we just don't know because we
Right.
nobody's tried it in like 200 years and or on
Yeah.
at least in a way that, is easy to study. And so I think that's going into like some of these things we've been talking about. I think um, one of the best aspects of all this is that you don't need to have, a 100-acre vineyard to do these things. It's actually better if you don't
Yeah.
because if you've got like a couple vines in your backyard or just like a small vineyard and it's not like what you're making your living on, it's just a fun hobby. It's a lot easier to plant like an apple tree in there and hike some grapes up into it, or
Yep.
plant wheat in the in the understory, or barley and brew your own beer with it, or do the
Yeah.
Provignage and see if like a superorganism grape is a great thing. That's a
Yeah.
lot easier when it's your backyard. So I think
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
no, I mean, that is it. I mean, you brought up the thing that I didn't really put a fine enough point on, which was the quality potential from a superorganism vine. Seems like you could have this multiplication of quality somehow, like because resources are being drawn or could be shuffled through an entire vineyard rather than just within a localized plant system and the microbe system essentially around it. And not that there aren't communications of microbes and things like that, but like when you literally have a circulatory system that runs through an entire vineyard, that's like really exciting. It seems like moving around nutrients to where they're needed, and just the sharing aspect seems like the quality of the entire vineyard would rise. But like you said, we don't know. Maybe not. Maybe it would all suck. I mean, I think the main reasons that it's there would be downsides to it would be first of all, the time for establishment, but then secondly, maybe the care is a little more difficult. And I wanted to follow up. That was my follow-up question for you. You said you discovered this when you were researching how people did things before, when they weren't using trellises or trees or things like that. How would this prevent this? Are these vines that are essentially running along the ground? Is that what they were doing? Because I mean, the way I've seen it is still using trellises or some sort of like stakes or things like that, where it's it goes up onto a trellis wire and then comes back down into the ground and then goes back up onto a trellis wire and goes back down into the ground. But if it wasn't using a trellis, what would it look like?
So it did use a trellis, but not, or at least it used stakes. So
Okay.
traditionally in France, I think they used chestnut stakes. Um,
Okay.
but I remember
So,
reading. Sorry, go ahead.
it goes up and then the canes drape down, and that's when they get tucked back in. Some of those canes that drape down get tucked into the ground, and then
Right,
you
and then the
throw them
rest,
up
yeah.
another stake.
hmm
Okay.
Um,
Sorry. Yeah. Please finish your thought. I
oh
didn't
yeah,
mean to.
no, just that like this was one of maybe like half a dozen different ways that people trellised grapes for thousands of years, right? Like I remember reading this study. They were looking at like the first viticulture in southern France. When these like Near Eastern grape varieties were first brought in, started to mix with like the local genetics and whatnot. Um, and it was just like kind of an overview of the archaeology of these vineyards. And what they're finding was that they were using a lot of different trellising techniques, right? They were going up the tree. They were doing the Provignage, superorganism thing. They were just planting them next to a stake individually. So people have been experimenting, and not just experimenting, but practicing um, a number of different, uh, grape growing techniques for thousands of years. And what we have around us today is a pretty like thin slice of the entire circle of like possibilities.
Right.
And revisiting like what really worked for people for a very long time, I think is not just important but also a lot of fun.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah. I mean, I I I just harken back to the trees as trellises again, because I mean, vines clearly evolved to climb trees. I mean, that's their symbiotic natural relationship. And I just think over millions of years that they existed with trees, there must be some really beneficial aspects that are happening in the soil, I guess is what I'm getting at. That like removing the vine from the tree, I think can't be as good for the vine as keeping it with the tree. Like it just, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I could be wrong about that. Obviously, we can experiment and find out. But this is one of the experiments I want to do. I want to do a tree trellised vineyard side by side, like a block of all the same kind of vines trellised side by side with a normal traditional trellis, and then make wine exactly the same way from them, and see what happens. See if there are quality differences. Because I don't know. It just is like, it would be so weird to me if there wasn't a quality benefit from being with the partner that they've had their entire existence until
Hmm.
the modern era. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it just would be so weird if that didn't help them in some way.
And people have been
And
commenting on that for a very long time. I mean, you go back to Roman writers like Pliny the Elder. I think he was writing about how the best grapes. Again, the Roman Empire, they had a number of different trellising systems, but he was saying the best grapes come from the ones up in trees, and and he even
yeah,
delineated which level of the tree trellis like the grapes were best on. Um,
right.
and even T.V. Munson, like the great American viticulturist, he in one of his books, he has this very quick line where he talks about seeing a grape grow up into a tree, and how it was just totally free of disease, right? Just something about like that
Right.
microclimate, or that relationship with the tree made that grapevine more resistant than others of the same genetics nearby.
Well,
Um,
this is other research that I'm finding as well, that they're doing. They're sort of doing vineyards as alley crop systems between trees, between
mhm,
tree rows, and they're finding that these are getting less mildew pressure as well, which is completely counterintuitive, right? Like, you're
mhm.
creating more shade, you're creating, like more still air, less breeze, like more, yeah, all the things that we think of as conducive to the mildews, are actually, they're finding that it's decreasing them. Now, this is like, this hasn't been studied extensively, and there's very little data, but because there's very little people doing it scientifically. It's but the initial places that are trying this and getting data are finding some really interesting things. It's yeah, like counterintuitive things. And again, like you said, it, to me, or not just quality in terms of that, but hardiness, it makes sense that they're getting benefits that we aren't aware of yet from doing that. But I don't know.
Yeah, and
I
with
mean, it seems,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I mean, I've heard old texts as well, where I've heard the opposite, where
Mhm.
they stopped doing it because of that. Once they discovered that they could have it on a trellis that wasn't in a tree. I mean, who knows? Like, I think we have to retest all these things, because so many of these things are like, you don't like even Pliny the Elder, was he comparing those grapes and trees to these high density, like trellised vineyards that are like bonsai basically in Napa Valley, or you know what I mean?
Right,
Like,
yeah.
what I mean? Like, is it the modern trellising that he was comparing it to? And maybe those do give better quality for some reason. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like, I would love these things to be done again, just to get, uh, yeah. But I think there's enough there to warrant revisiting them, I guess is what I'm saying. What you're saying sounds like as well.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think especially here in North America, we have a really special opportunity with this kind of thing, because we already know, like, the really diverse palette of trees that were paired or married to vines in Europe, and they were,
Right.
half the time it was, like, fruit trees, cultivated ones, half the time it was just native trees that, you pull out of the
Right.
forest, right? So it's, when you bring native plants into an agricultural system, there's a lot more biodiversity there too that frequently is beneficial. Um,
Yeah.
and here in North America, we have completely different palettes of trees. Right, nothing is native here that is native over there. So, what happens when you train a grape tree into a persimmon? Right, what happens when you train a grape tree into a pecan? What happens when you train
Mm,
a grape tree into any of the whatever is growing in your bioregion? Um,
yeah.
there's so many opportunities to see like what actually works here, and how can um, the tree that I plant next to this vine actually serve me in different ways. Like, do I want to make persimmon brandy now, right? Or do I want to
Yeah.
use this as to, use this different kind of wood to help age the final product? Um, and yeah, I'd be really curious to see what people come up with. And that's why work like that, Mark Shepard and others like him are doing is really interesting to me. There's
Yeah.
a lot of potential there.
Well, and I don't know if you've thought through this as in as much detail as I have, because I really am maybe a year away from implementing this. Maybe 2 years, but we'll see. I mean, a few things have to fall into place, but maybe on a large enough scale where it's studyable. Um, I can't get away from the idea that, like, if it's going to be, and maybe I shouldn't think about this, like, Mark clearly doesn't care too much about these commercial demands in terms of, well, I think he does. I mean, it has to be harvestable. You know what I mean? So you can't have the vine doing what it naturally would do, which is climb to the top of a 40-foot tree. You know what I mean? Like, you just, like, harvesting that way is dangerous. It's time consuming. It's labor intensive. It could never. And you know what? I was just about to say it could never scale, but, like, maybe scaling shouldn't be our objective at this point in history. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of been part of our problem. Um, so I mean, maybe I should take that back, but I guess I say it because I want it to be something that could be an alternative to, you know, at least to attempt to an alternative to our current production of things, to as closely as possible, while being a much more ecologically sound and beneficial solution. And so that's why I care about the ease of harvest, the scalability of it. And so that's why I mean, what I've landed on, and also just, I do think there is a competition for ripening for sunlight. There is absolutely I mean, I see the vines in the East Coast growing in the trees, and there's, like, those vines have to grow really, really high because the canopy closes, and they, for them to get any light at all, like, they have to get way up there. And that competition is real. And I think if you want ripe grapes that taste delicious, and it's not just about, propagating the seeds that just barely need to ripen enough for a bird to eat them and fly away and poop them somewhere else. If you really want ripe, delicious, winemaking grapes, the only thing that I can think of is coppicing. Again, I mean pollarding here, to as a way to maintain these, and then that sort of eliminates, in a way, the secondary food crop for these trees, because, or maybe some form of espalier, where you're keeping it at a certain height, and then you are training vine canes between tree branches, and each one, so you'll have a fruiting grape cane and then a fruiting apple branch kind of thing, and then, alternating down the line, in an espalier sort of section. I could see that. I mean, a lot of work to that, but totally possible, maybe. But I think you need them to be at the same height so that the sun hits them evenly, I guess, is what what I'm trying to get to. And I've really thought about different ways of doing this. I don't know if you've considered any of this at all, but I'm just throwing these ideas out there as things that I'm thinking about.
Well, in Europe, there's actually I'm always surprised at new ways that I'm seeing, or not new ways,
Okay.
but I mean old ways that people were doing things. In some, if you look at paintings and prints, and even into the 19th century photographs of different regions in Italy, the entire landscape was just lined with trees that had grapes draping between them. So I think
Yeah.
that it definitely is something that's scalable, and not in the same intensive way as you won't get the same yield out of like a densely planted block of grapes, but in terms of a comprehensive agricultural system, it absolutely is scalable.
Okay.
Accounts from the 17th century of like French or German travelers in around Naples, like they talk about every road they would go down, on each side of the road are just all these tall trees with grapes between them, and then wheat underneath. And in terms of, excuse me, like, yeah, like you're bringing up some really good points about, like the height of the trees and trellising them, and from what I've seen, at least from different illustrations uh, of different ages, is like there was maybe even like a dozen or 2 dozen different ways to actually train the grapevine into the tree. They would
Oh,
train one, or they'd train two, and then they'd tie them together, or let them go different directions. Like there's all kinds of different ways, and
right.
on actually like on the article on my website, I think one of the slideshows is actually a number of those different illustrations of different methods for training.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and so I've always really wanted to kind of experiment with those and see like, oh, what works well for what trees. I think,
Right. And which grapes?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So some of the old paintings you see, they're training grapes in these like 80-foot tall trees, and then very sketchily climbing a very rickety tall ladder to get to them. And
Right.
that's not really scalable, right? That's not really something that you want to do.
Right. Send little Johnny up.
Yeah.
He's expendable.
But there's so many different small trees that don't cast a lot of shade that have all these other benefits that can be used instead. So you can keep the vines um, at harvestable height for just a normal human being, but still
Right.
keep them a little bit off the ground. So potentially even have small livestock underneath them and not risk them getting eaten. Um,
Right. That's the other advantage if you're growing them. Yeah. Right. At head height and above. Then you've got sheep, you've got pigs, chickens, geese, like the whole range, except for maybe cows. But I mean, yeah, the cows would probably eat something at my head height for sure. Unless they were short cows, you can breed short cows. I know people are doing that. Um, uh, yeah, I mean that is the advantage, and that's I mean my vision as well is it would be, it's meant to contain to have year round grazing. So it's like doing what Cully Mulville is doing at Piscinus Ranch, but where his trellis is made of trees rather than trellis. And so you've got this like just a living, it's a vine forest, a wine forest is what I want
mm,
to build essentially. That allows for year-round grazing of also farm animals that are second, third, fourth, fifth crops or whatever, as well as maybe that's in part. I mean, it depends on how much space you have. Maybe you have some of your between row stuff be like annual crops or things like that, and you only let the animals in there certain times a year when the crops aren't growing, and maybe do that everywhere. You're rotating. You grow beans and then let the pigs in after you harvest the beans to mow down the bean plants or the sheep or whatever, and vice versa. All kinds of stuff like that. I mean, the whole idea is that uh, everything is adding fertility to the whole system. You're feeding the animals and birds, and you're feeding the vines and trees, and that's feeding and shading these lower story crops that need shade from the our increasingly hot sunshine. Yeah, and I'm looking at this. You're right. I mean, I, I I do see the slideshow now, and it is really interesting to see how they're doing this. And I
yeah.
guess you could, they're doing. So what I'm seeing them do is these really long. Well, there's multiple ways that they're doing things. You're right. You could you could let them go way up into the tree and then drape down where the fruiting canes are, so that the fruiting canes hang down to head height, even though the vine starts above that, and they just sort of drape down to where you can just pick as the fruiting canes hang out from the bottom of the tree. Yeah, anyway, I could describe all these, but the pictures will probably do the job. But I guess I could see how you wouldn't have to just coppice them all. I mean,
Yeah.
potentially, if you grew them far enough apart and had the vines grow long enough between them, and did good pruning on both of them. I think it does take a good bit of pruning. I mean, a good bit of expertise in pruning or experimentation in pruning to get it right. It seems like, but yeah,
I've
really,
definitely also seen like different on in different farms that still exist there, like doing these practices. I've definitely also seen them do like pollarding, um, and
okay,
uh,
yeah.
and especially with things like
Oh yeah, I said
poplars.
coppicing. I meant pollarding. That's what I meant. Sorry.
And for those who don't know, like the difference is, coppicing is where you cut the tree or the shrub at essentially at soil level, And pollarding is
Right.
where you leave the main trunk and then kind of cut it up at the top. And so that's like you're saying, that's one really great way of reducing height and also getting a yield at the same time. Because especially if it's some like one of the fodder trees, which a lot of trees are, a tree that livestock would like to eat, then every time you prune it, you're just pruning food for your sheep. Um,
Right.
or
Yeah, that
sticks for the fireplace or for basket making or whatever.
yeah, or like you wood something that can be chipped and used to inoculate with mushroom spawn, that kind of thing, where it's you've created this other, yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
another product source. Um, yeah, sorry, pollarding. Yeah, I mean, the advantages. That gives you all these little things versus like pruning a tree where but you also don't have to it keeps it at the height that you want the trellis, this quote unquote trellis to be, that you want the
Hmm.
grapevines to be, so you can like that's what I'm saying, if you pollard right at head height, that's like essentially where your grow head is for your vine, training between those pollarded trees. Yeah. um Man, well, I could continue to talk for a long time
Yeah,
with
this
you.
has been great.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. And again, thanks for all the work that you did on this, because it's finding all these things from all over the internet, saves people a lot of time and puts it all into a cohesive and, I think a really strong argument, a really like unified and historically, we see the flow from history to the present and how these could be implemented. Oh, I know the question I would ask you. Where can somebody go? Where have you seen some really good examples of these, or where do you know that people could go to see this in real life, like see some of these historic polyculture farms that have, specifically like vines and trees, but uh, the whole
Yeah.
systems.
So there's a couple places so historically, different variations of the system were concentrated in the Po Valley and near Venice and Tuscany, Umbria, and then around Naples and in Sicily. And a couple other places around the Mediterranean as well, but those were like the main hot spots. In each spot, each area had its own kind of variation on it. So I know that there's still like I think it's called Vigneto Storico di Baver. It's like I haven't been there, but I've read about it. It's an historic vineyard, a little bit north of Venice, and
Okay.
a lot of the photographs on my article were taken from a document that was written about that place, that have like living examples of it. So I know there's that. I do know that there are a few other places around Italy that people who study this practice know about and are preserving, but I'm not connected well enough with them to know much about them. Um, but I think uh, definitely in Sicily and southern Italy too, um, you might have more luck finding this kind of thing. And there, it also
Oh,
can get like more disaggregated, so it might not be the same kinds of very clean rows of trees with vines, and then fields between them in this very geometric way that you see up in northern Italy. Down there, it's more like you'll have a terrace, and there'll be like an olive tree and a pomegranate, and then a grape, and a couple grapes, and a bunch of wheat. And it's just part of this really complex agro ecosystem that is a little bit less formalized, at least from what I've seen.
oh, yeah,
And
those
I've heard
are.
about some really interesting examples in Portugal too, but I don't know enough
Yes.
about like how much they've survived. But at least until like the later half of the 20th century, I know there's quite a number of different trellising systems being done out there.
Nice. I really appreciate your work there. It's inspiring.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate being on your show. Yeah, this has been a lot of fun.
Oh, my pleasure.